The frequency of memory. The house stood a little off the road, where gravel had long since given way to packed earth and thin grass pushing through faint tire tracks. It couldn't be called abandoned. The windows were clean, the door repainted a faded blue, and a simple wooden chair rested on the porch. But there was a quiet living inside it, a particular deep quiet that doesn't come from emptiness, but from time. His name was Harold Whittaker, and he was 79. He woke early, not because he wanted to, but because he always had. Sleep left him gently, without resistance, as if it no longer had a reason to stay. Each morning began the same way. He opened his eyes and lay still for a while, listening to the house breathe, the faint creak of wood, the distant push of wind against the walls, sometimes the soft scurry of a mouse in the pantry. Then he rose slowly, carefully, as though each movement required permission from the past. Everything in the kitchen had its place. A cup with a thin crack along the handle, a metal kettle that no longer whistled, only hummed quietly, a gas stove lit by a match. He didn't trust anything automatic. He never rushed. The water heated, and while the kettle did its work, Harold stood by the window. Beyond the glass was a world that continued without him. An occasional car on the road, birds that had followed the same routes for decades, and light, soft, early, almost transparent. The light was always the same, or at least it seemed that way. He poured his tea, sat at the table, and for a while simply held the cup in his hands, as if it could offer him more than warmth, as if it might return something that had long since gone. The house was small, but there was one room where Harold spent most of his time, the workshop. It sat in a side extension, an old space with a low ceiling, wooden beams, and the lingering smell of dust, metal, and aged varnish. Tools lined the walls, many of them no longer in use. Screwdrivers, pliers, coils of wire, boxes of parts whose names he had forgotten but could never bring himself to throw away. And in the centre, a table, and on the table, the radio, an old receiver with a dark wooden corpus, worn smooth along the edges, a circular dial beneath glass that once glowed with city names, New York, Chicago, Boston. Now the lettering had faded, and the glass bore fine scratches, as if time itself had tried to erase them. Harold reached out and ran his fingers across its surface. He did that almost every day. The radio wasn't rare. There had once been many like it, but this one had remained. He didn't turn it on right away. Sometimes he simply sat before it, as if it were something alive, something that might answer if given enough time. Today he switched it on. A click, a low hum, and then noise, static, uneven, restless, like breathing that couldn't find its rhythm. A hiss broken by brief surges, as though something far away was trying to force its way through. Harold turned the tuning knob slightly. The noise shifted, thinned, sharpened, then collapsed again into scattered waves. He did it mechanically, without much hope. Sometimes he found stations, news music, voices too clear, too modern. They never held him for long. He moved past them until he heard it. At first he didn't understand. It wasn't a word, not immediately, more like an intonation, a cadence, something familiar, but just out of reach. He froze, his fingers stilled on the dial. The noise softened, almost disappeared, and through it a voice. "You promised you'd be back before fall." The voice was distant, as if underwater. Young, female. Harold frowned. He leaned closer, nearly pressing his ear to the radio. "Don't stay away, please." The static swelled again, the words dissolving into it. He turned the knob sharply. The signal vanished, only noise remained. He sat motionless. A minute, 2, maybe longer. His heart was beating faster than usual. It felt strange to notice it again, as if it had quietly returned to him after being absent for years. He began turning the knob again, slowly, carefully, but nothing, only static. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. "Just imagination," he said quietly, though there was no one else in the room. The voice could have been anything. Signal overlap, old recordings, a stray frequency. He knew that, but knowing didn't settle it, because there had been something in that voice, something not technical, something human, something familiar. He opened his eyes and looked at the radio again. Light from the window fell across it at an angle, dividing the wooden body into 2 halves, light and shadow, as if the object existed in 2 places at once. Harold slowly reached out and switched it off. The click sounded too loud. The silence returned. But it wasn't the same. It had grown denser, deeper, and within it, at the very edge of perception, something lingered, faint, almost ungraspable, like a memory that did not belong to the present. Harold stood. He walked through the workshop, unable to settle, then stopped by the window. Outside, the wind moved lightly through the grass. Everything looked ordinary, normal, but inside, no. It took him a moment to understand what had changed, and then it came to him. He wasn't trying to remember the voice, he was trying to recognize it. And that was far worse, because if it wasn't an accident, if it truly was what it seemed, then the past hadn't ended. It had simply been waiting for a signal. The town didn't have a name people outside of it remembered. It appeared on maps, printed in small, unassuming letters, somewhere along a stretch of coast that most travellers passed without noticing. There was a gas station, a diner, a post office that closed too early, and a grocery store where the shelves were never quite full, but never empty either. Houses leaned slightly toward the ocean, as if listening. The wind carried salt. It settled into wood, into clothes, into the spaces between things. It softened edges. It preserved some things, erased others. Time moved differently there, not slower exactly, but with less urgency. Days folded into each other. Seasons announced themselves quietly, and in that town, on a road that curved just enough to disappear from view, lived people who had either chosen not to leave or never found a reason to. Ethan Cole had always told himself he would. He was 23, though he felt older in ways that didn't have anything to do with years. There was a restlessness in him that never quite settled, like a question that refused to be fully formed. He worked at the marina, not because he loved the work, but because it was there. Boats came and went, ropes needed tying, engines needed checking. There was always something to fix, something to carry, something that didn't ask questions. He preferred that. That morning, the sky was pale and stretched thin across the horizon. The water was calm, but not still, never still. It moved in slow, repeating patterns, as if remembering something. Ethan stood on the dock, coiling a length of rope with practiced hands. The fibres were rough against his skin, familiar, grounding. He didn't notice how long he'd been standing there until a voice broke through. "You always look like you're waiting for something." He didn't turn right away. "I'm working," he said, barely. He glanced over his shoulder. She was standing a few steps away, hands tucked into the pockets of an oversized sweater, hair pulled back loosely as if it had never quite agreed to stay in place. The wind moved through it, catching strands of light. Lena Hart. She was 21 and she moved through the town differently than everyone else, not slower, not faster, just more aware, as if she noticed the things people usually passed by. People who are working don't stare at the same piece of water for 10 minutes, she said. I wasn't staring. You were. Ethan finished coiling the rope and set it down. Why are you here? He asked. Lena shrugged slightly. Thought you might be. That's not an answer. It is. You just don't like it. He exhaled through his nose, somewhere between amusement and irritation. She stepped closer to the edge of the dock, looking out over the water. It's quiet today, she said. It's always quiet. No, she shook her head lightly. Not like this. Ethan didn't respond. He followed her gaze instead. There was nothing unusual, just the same grey-blue water, the same distant line where the ocean met the sky. A buoy rocked gently in the distance, a gull cut across the air, its cry brief and sharp. Still, there was something about the quiet. It felt held, as if the world were pausing between breaths. You ever think about leaving? Lena asked suddenly. Ethan let out a small, humorless breath. Everyone asked that. I didn't ask everyone. He looked at her then. She wasn't looking at him, still at the water. I think about it, he said after a moment. That's not the same. No, he agreed, it's not. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just unfinished. Lena shifted her weight, then turned slightly, glancing back toward the town. I stopped by your place yesterday, she said. Ethan frowned. Why? You weren't there. That doesn't answer the question. There was a note on your door, she continued as if he hadn't spoken, from Mrs. Daly. Something about a radio. Ethan blinked. What? She said you might be able to fix it, or at least look at it. I fix boat engines, Lena. You fix things, she corrected gently. There's a difference. He rubbed the back of his neck. I don't do house calls. You used to. That was different. Why? He didn't answer, because he didn't have one that made sense. Lena watched him for a moment, then looked back at the water. She said it belongs to Mr. Whittaker. Something in the name shifted the air. Not visibly, not audibly, but enough. Ethan's expression changed just slightly, but enough that Lena noticed. You know him? She asked. I've seen him, Ethan said. Everyone has. He lives out past the bend, right? Yeah. The quiet house. They're all quiet, Ethan said. Not like his. Ethan didn't argue, because she wasn't wrong. There was something about that house, not eerie, not abandoned, just distant, as if it existed a step removed from everything else. He doesn't come into town much, Lena said. No, but people still talk about him. People always talk. She glanced at Ethan again. What do they say? He hesitated, then shrugged. Nothing clear, just that he used to be different. How? Ethan picked up the rope again, though it didn't need fixing. Like everyone else, he said, before they stopped being. Lena didn't respond right away. The wind shifted slightly, brushing past them. You should go, she said. To his house? Yeah. Why? She smiled faintly. Because you're already thinking about it. Ethan looked down at his hands. She wasn't wrong. Again, that's not a good reason, he said. It's the only kind that matters. He let out a quiet breath. The dock creaked softly beneath them. Somewhere, a loose piece of metal tapped in the wind. irregular, almost rhythmic. Ethan looked back toward the town. From here it seemed smaller, contained, like something that could be stepped out of, if only you knew how. "You're coming with me?" he asked. Lena tilted her head slightly. "You want me to?" "No." "Then yes." He almost smiled. Almost. They stood there a moment longer. The quiet hadn't lifted. If anything, it had deepened, as if something, somewhere, had already begun. And neither of them yet knew that the sound waiting for them wasn't meant for the present. But it was coming anyway. The road narrowed after the last cluster of houses, bending gently, as if unsure whether it should continue at all. Gravel gave way to dirt, and the air changed, subtly at first, then unmistakably. The wind carried less salt here, more earth, more stillness. Ethan drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely near the gear shift. The truck rattled over uneven ground, a familiar sound that filled the silence between them. Lena sat by the window, her elbow propped against the door, watching the landscape slip past. Fences leaned inward, fields stretched quiet and unworked, and here and there a tree stood alone, its branches bare, in a way that didn't feel entirely seasonal. Neither of them spoke much, not because there was nothing to say, but because something in the air discouraged it. "You've been here before?" Lena asked finally, without turning. Ethan nodded. "Once or twice." "And?" He shrugged. "It's just a house." She glanced at him. "You don't believe that?" He didn't answer. The road curved again, and then they saw it. Set back from the path, partially hidden behind a stand of thin, wind-bent trees, stood the house. It wasn't large, not imposing, but it held itself differently from the others in town. The paint, faded blue, had been maintained, not recently, but carefully. The windows reflected the sky in a way that made them seem almost opaque. The porch was simple, with a single wooden chair angled toward the road, as if someone had once sat there often enough to leave a memory in its position. Ethan slowed the truck. The engine idled. For a moment, neither of them moved. "That's it?" Lena asked quietly. "That's it." She studied it. "It feels—" She didn't finish. Ethan turned off the engine. The sudden absence of sound made the space around them feel larger. Too large. They stepped out. The ground was firm but uneven beneath their feet. Grass brushed against their shoes, dry and whispering. No movement, no voices, just wind, lighter here, somehow restrained. Lena took a few steps forward, then stopped. "Do you feel that?" she asked. Ethan closed the truck door. "Feel what?" She hesitated. "Like it's already aware of us." He looked at her, then at the house. "That doesn't make any sense. I didn't say it did." He exhaled, then walked toward the porch. Each step seemed louder than it should have been. The boards creaked faintly as he climbed the steps, the sound stretching into the quiet like something fragile. Lena followed, slower. Up close the house revealed its details. The faint scratches along the doorframe, the worn edge of the step where countless feet had passed. A small crack in the window glass, carefully sealed, nothing abandoned, nothing neglected, just held in place. Ethan raised his hand and knocked. The sound was solid, real. It lingered. They waited. Nothing. He knocked again. This time there was movement inside, subtle, measured, a shift of weight, a floorboard responding. Then the door opened. Harold Whittaker stood there. For a moment no one spoke. He looked at them, not surprised, not curious, just attentive, as if he had been expecting something, though not necessarily them. His eyes lingered on Ethan first, then moved to Lena. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but precise. "Yes?" Harold said. His voice was quiet, steady. Ethan cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitaker?" A small nod. "My name's Ethan. Ethan Cole. Mrs. Daly said you might need help with a radio." The word hung in the air. Radio. Something shifted again. Barely visible, but present. Harold's gaze returned to Ethan. Then, slowly, he stepped back. "Come in," he said. They crossed the threshold. The air inside was cooler, still. Not stale, just untouched by movement. The room opened into a modest living space, simple but ordered. A worn armchair near the window, a small table with a folded newspaper, shelves with books that looked as though they had been read more than once, but not recently. Light entered carefully, filtered through thin curtains. It didn't fill the room. It settled. Lena paused just inside, her eyes adjusting. There was a smell, wood, dust, and something faintly metallic. "Through there," Harold said, already turning. They followed him. The hallway was narrow, the walls lined with framed photographs. Most were turned slightly away, as if they hadn't been looked at in some time. Lena's gaze lingered on one, a blurred image of a younger man standing beside a woman. The edges had faded, the faces were indistinct, but the posture, close, not touching, but almost. She slowed, then kept walking. The workshop opened before them, and there it was, the radio. It sat exactly where it belonged, at the center of the room, on a sturdy wooden table, surrounded by tools that had not been disturbed recently. For a moment, no one spoke. Ethan stepped closer. "Old model," he said quietly. "Tube-based, I think." Harold said nothing. Lena remained near the doorway. She felt it before she understood it. A faint vibration in the air. Not sound, not exactly. More like the memory of sound. Ethan reached out, examining the knobs, the casing. "What's wrong with it?" he asked. A pause. Then Harold spoke. "It started yesterday." Ethan glanced back. "Stopped working?" Harold shook his head. "No." Another pause. Then, "It started working." The words settled heavily. Ethan frowned slightly. "That's usually a good thing." Harold looked at the radio, not at Ethan. "It depends on what you hear." Silence stretched. Lena took a step forward. "Can you show us?" she asked softly. Harold hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. Then, slowly, he reached out. His hand hovered over the switch. For a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, click, the radio came alive, a low hum, and then static. Not loud, not aggressive, just present, like something waiting. Ethan leaned in, instinctively adjusting the tuning dial. The noise shifted, rose, fell. Fragments of distant stations flickered and vanished. Nothing clear, nothing stable. "See?" Ethan said quietly. "Probably just interference." He stopped because the static changed. It narrowed, focused, and beneath it, something else, a shape, a rhythm. Lena felt her chest tighten. Harold didn't move. The sound grew clearer, and then a voice, faint, young. "You said—" The words broke apart, returned. "Before it gets cold." Ethan froze, his hand still on the dial. The room felt smaller, closer. The voice flickered in and out, like light through moving water. "I'll wait. I always—" Static surged, then dropped again. Harold's eyes had not left the radio, but something in them had changed. Recognition, Not sudden, not shocked, but slow, certain, like something long buried finding its way back. Lena whispered, almost to herself, "That's not live." Ethan didn't answer, because he knew. And Harold closed his eyes, just for a second, as if bracing against something he had already lived once, and now was being asked to hear again. The voice dissolved as suddenly as it had appeared. Static surged, louder this time, harsher, filling the room like wind forcing its way through a narrow space. Then, just as quickly, it thinned again into a low, restless hum. Ethan didn't move. His hand was still on the dial, fingers frozen mid-adjustment, as if even the smallest motion might erase something important. "Did you hear that?" Lena asked quietly. It wasn't really a question. "Yes," Ethan said. Harold said nothing. He stood slightly apart from them, his posture unchanged, but there was a tension in the stillness now, as if something inside him had shifted out of alignment. Ethan slowly released the dial. The radio continued its uneven breathing. "Could be an old recording," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Sometimes signals bounce, atmospheric conditions, interference. You can pick up things from far away." "From when?" Lena asked. He hesitated. "That depends." She stepped closer to the table. Her gaze wasn't on the knobs or the wires. It was on the sound, or rather, what remained of it. "Say it again," she said softly, almost to the radio itself. Nothing answered, only static. Ethan glanced at Harold. "You've heard this before?" A pause, then Harold nodded. "Yesterday," he said, "and again this morning." Ethan shifted his weight. "Same voice." Another pause. "Yes." Something tightened in the room, not visibly, but undeniably. Lena leaned in slightly. "There was emotion in it," she said. "It didn't sound like a broadcast." "It was a broadcast," Ethan replied quickly. "Everything on a radio is a broadcast." Lena looked at him. "Not like that." He opened his mouth to respond, then stopped, because he didn't have a better answer. The radio crackled again. A brief fluctuation. Ethan instinctively reached for the dial. "Wait," Harold said. Ethan froze. Harold stepped closer. Not quickly, not urgently, but with a kind of quiet certainty. "Don't chase it," he said. Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Harold looked at the radio, not at the controls, but at the sound itself, as if it had shape. "It doesn't respond to that." Lena tilted her head slightly. "Then what does it respond to?" Harold didn't answer immediately. His hand hovered near the table, then lowered again without touching anything. "I don't know," he said, but there was something in the way he said it, as if he did and wished he didn't. Silence settled again, thicker now. Ethan stepped back slightly, folding his arms. "Okay," he said, exhaling. "Let's assume for a second this isn't just interference." "That's a big assumption," Lena said. "Yeah," he agreed, "but let's make it anyway." He gestured toward the radio. "If it's not random, then it's repeating. Patterns, signals loop. That's how recordings behave." Lena watched him. "You're trying to make it smaller." "I'm trying to understand it." "No," she said gently. "You're trying to make it less." Ethan met her gaze. "And you're doing the opposite." "Maybe." They held each other's glad for a moment. Then Ethan looked away first. Harold had moved closer to the window. Light fell across his face unevenly, catching in the lines, deepening them. For a moment he looked both older and, strangely, younger, as if something long dormant had stirred. "Play it again," Lena said. Ethan shook his head slightly. It's not a tape. No, she said. But it came once. That doesn't mean we can try. The word was quiet, but it held. Ethan hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached for the dial again. He turned it, carefully this time, as if precision mattered more than logic. Static shifted, deepened. A low frequency rolled beneath it, almost like distant thunder. Nothing. Then a flicker. You said... Ethan's hand stopped instantly. The voice returned, but thinner, more fragile. You said you wouldn't. The signal fractured. Lena stepped closer without realizing it. Wait, don't move, she whispered. Ethan didn't. He barely breathed. The radio trembled with unstable sound. I waited. Static surged, cutting the sentence apart. Then, silence, not complete, but close enough to feel like loss. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That's not a loop, he said. No, Lena replied. Harold remained by the window, but his hand had moved. It rested now on the back of the chair beside him, fingers gripping the wood just slightly too tight. Ethan looked at him. You recognize it, he said. It wasn't a question this time. Harold's gaze stayed on the light. Yes, he said quietly. Lena's chest tightened. Who is it? A long pause, the kind that stretches not because of hesitation, but because of distance. Harold turned his head slightly, not fully toward them, just enough. It's a voice I haven't heard in a very long time. That's not what I asked, Lena said gently. He nodded. I know. Another pause. Then, it's someone I used to know. Ethan exhaled. That's still not much. Harold almost smiled. Almost. No, he said. It isn't. The radio crackled again, but no voice followed. Just the steady, uncertain noise, like something searching and not yet finding what it needed. Lena stepped back slightly. There's more, she said. Ethan glanced at her. What makes you say that? She looked at the radio, then at Harold. Because it hasn't finished. Harold closed his eyes again, just for a moment, and in that moment the room felt suspended between what had already happened and what was still trying to return. The radio did not speak again that afternoon. It remained on, quietly breathing its thin, restless static, while the three of them lingered in the workshop, as if leaving too soon might cause something to vanish completely. Ethan tried to take the back panel off. He worked methodically, almost stubbornly, unscrewing the small rusted fasteners, lifting the cover with care. Inside, the components were old but intact. Vacuum tubes, wiring, dust settled in soft layers that suggested years of stillness rather than neglect. Nothing's burned, he said, more to himself than to the others. No obvious damage. Lena stood behind him, arms loosely crossed, watching not the parts, but the way he moved. You're disappointed, she said. He didn't look at her. I'm not. You are. He tightened his grip on the screwdriver. I'm not disappointed that something isn't broken. No, she said softly. You're disappointed because you can't explain it. He stopped, just for a second, then continued. Harold hadn't moved much. He had taken the chair near the window and sat there, hands resting on his knees, his gaze drifting between the light and the radio, not watching, not avoiding, listening, even now, as if the silence itself might contain something unfinished. Ethan replaced the back panel and straightened up. It's working exactly the way it's supposed to, he said. Lena tilted her head. Then what did we hear? Ethan hesitated. A signal, he said. Distorted, reflected, delayed. It happens. Does it? She asked. Yes, Voices like that? He didn't answer, because no, not like that, not with that kind of weight, not with that kind of presence. Lena turned toward Harold. When did you first hear her? She asked. The word lingered. Her. Harold didn't correct it. Yesterday morning, he said. Same words? He shook his head slowly. No. What did she say? A pause. Longer this time. Ethan glanced at him, sensing something in the hesitation. Not uncertainty, but resistance, as if the act of repeating it would make it more real. She asked if I remembered, Harold said finally. Lena felt something tighten in her chest. Remembered what? Harold's gaze drifted to the radio. She didn't say. Ethan leaned back against the table. That doesn't make sense. Harold nodded faintly. No, he agreed, it doesn't. But you think it's connected to you? Ethan pressed. Another pause. Yes. How? Harold's fingers moved slightly against his knees, just enough to betray the tension. Because I recognized the voice. The room seemed to contract around the words. Lena took a small step forward. Who is she? Harold looked at her then, fully, for the first time since they had arrived. There was something fragile in his expression now, not weakness, but exposure, as if the past had edges sharper than he had remembered. Someone I loved, he said. Silence followed, not empty, heavy. Ethan shifted slightly, uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite place. That doesn't explain how her voice is coming through a radio, he said. No, Harold replied. It doesn't. Lena spoke more carefully now. Is she? She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Harold understood. Yes, he said quietly. She's gone. The words settled like dust. Gone. Not dramatic, not sudden, just final. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck again. Okay, he said, exhaling. So we're hearing the voice of someone who... He stopped himself, because saying it out loud felt wrong, too direct, too small. Lena stepped closer to the table. What was her name? She asked. Harold didn't answer right away. The light had shifted slightly in the room, moving across the floor, climbing the edge of the table, touching the base of the radio. Time was passing, even here, even now. Margaret, he said. The name felt different from everything else that had been said, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it carried something intact, unbroken. Ethan repeated it quietly, almost testing it. Margaret. Harold nodded once. Lena looked at the radio. Do you think she's trying to tell you something? Ethan exhaled. Or it's just pulling fragments from somewhere. Old broadcasts, recordings, radio waves don't just disappear. Lena glanced at him. People do. He didn't respond, because that wasn't what he meant. But it wasn't wrong either. The radio crackled faintly. All three of them turned toward it instinctively. Nothing, just static, but different now, quieter, as if it had already said enough for the moment. Harold stood slowly. His movements were careful, but not fragile, deliberate. He stepped closer to the table. For a moment he didn't touch the radio. He simply stood there, looking at it, not as an object, but as something that had crossed a boundary it shouldn't have been able to. I haven't heard her voice in 40 years, he said. No one spoke, not even in memory, he added. Memory changes things, softens them, edges blur. His hand moved, hovering just above the wooden surface. But this, he said quietly, this wasn't memory. Lena felt a chill move through her, not fear exactly, but recognition of something deeper. something that didn't belong to explanation. Ethan looked at Harold. Then what is it? Harold didn't answer, because there was no answer that would hold. Instead, he turned the radio off. The click echoed slightly in the room. The static vanished, and in its place, silence, not empty, never empty, but now it carried something else, something that hadn't been there before, a question, not spoken, not formed, but present and waiting. Lena stepped back toward the doorway. "We should come back tomorrow," she said. Ethan looked at her. "Why?" She met his gaze. "Because it's not finished." Harold didn't look at them, but he heard her, and somewhere, beneath the weight of years and choices left unmade, he knew she was right, because whatever had found its way through that radio had not come just to be heard. It had come to be answered. They didn't leave right away. The decision hung in the room long after Lena had spoken it, settling into the quiet like dust that refused to be disturbed. Outside, the light had shifted again, afternoon leaning slowly toward evening, shadows stretching longer across the floorboards, softening edges that had once seemed fixed. Ethan stood near the table, hands resting against the worn wood, as if grounding himself in something solid. "You really think this is going to continue?" he asked. Lena didn't answer immediately. She was standing closer to the window now, where Harold had been earlier. The light touched her face unevenly, catching in her eyes. "It already has," she said. "That's not what I meant." "I know." He waited. She turned slightly, looking not at him, but at the space between them. "Things don't just happen like that once," she said. "Not if they matter." Ethan let out a quiet breath. "That's not how radio works." "No," she agreed softly, "but maybe that's not what this is." He didn't argue, because arguing required certainty, and he didn't have it. Harold remained near the radio. He hadn't moved since switching it off. There was a stillness to him now that felt different from before, not the quiet of routine, but the quiet of something newly unsettled. He reached out, almost unconsciously, and rested his hand on the wooden surface again. The radio was cold. Or maybe it had always been. He couldn't tell. "When it spoke this morning," he said suddenly, "it wasn't broken." Ethan looked at him. "What do you mean?" Harold's gaze stayed fixed on the receiver. It was clearer. Lena stepped closer. How clear? Harold hesitated, then, clear enough to understand without trying. The room seemed to tighten around the words. Ethan frowned. "Then why didn't you—" He stopped, because the question didn't make sense. Why hadn't he what? Listened harder? Answered? Prepared? There was no way to prepare for something like that. "I didn't expect it," Harold said, as if finishing the thought for him. "Not like that." Lena's voice softened. What did she say? A long pause, the kind that carried weight. Harold's fingers moved slightly along the edge of the radio. "She said my name." The air shifted, not visibly, but enough. Ethan felt it, a subtle tightening in his chest. "What name?" he asked. Harold didn't look at him. "The one she used." "That's the same name, isn't it?" Harold shook his head. "No." Lena's brows drew together slightly. "What do you mean?" Another pause, then, quieter. "She didn't call me Harold." Silence deepened. Ethan straightened slightly. "What did she call you?" Harold closed his eyes briefly, as if the answer wasn't just a word, but a door. "Harry," he said. The name lingered, younger, lighter, belonging to someone who no longer stood in this room. Lena felt something shift inside her, something tender, almost painful. "Did anyone else call you that?" she asked. Harold opened his eyes again. "No." Ethan looked at the radio. "Then it's not random." Lena nodded slightly. "No," she said, "it isn't." The light outside dimmed further. Shadows grew longer, deeper. The room began to change, not physically, but perceptually. Edges softened, colours cooled, time moved forward, whether they wanted it to or not. "We should go," Ethan said after a while. Lena didn't argue this time, not because she agreed, but because she understood. There was only so much the moment could hold, and they had already taken too much from it. Harold didn't stop them. He stepped back slightly, giving them space to move, though his eyes remained on the radio. Ethan paused at the doorway. "If it happens again," he said, "you should—" He stopped because he didn't know what to suggest. Record it? Write it down? Listen? None of it felt sufficient. Harold saved him from finishing. "I will," he said. Ethan nodded once, then turned. Lena lingered a moment longer. She looked at Harold, not with curiosity, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet recognition. "Don't ignore it," she said. Harold met her gaze. "I won't." She hesitated, then added, "even if it hurts." Something in his expression shifted. "Barely." "I know," he said. Lena gave a small nod, then followed Ethan out. The door closed behind them with a soft final sound. And just like that, the house returned to stillness. But it wasn't the same stillness as before. Harold stood alone in the workshop. The light had dimmed enough now that the room felt suspended between day and night. He didn't move right away. He listened, not to the radio, but to what remained after it. Silence, but not empty, never empty. He walked slowly to the window. Outside, the sky had begun to fade into deeper shades of blue, the first hints of evening settling over the fields. For a moment, he considered leaving the room, closing the door, letting the radio sit in the dark, unheard, unanswered. But the thought didn't stay, because something had already changed, not in the radio, in him. He turned back. The receiver sat exactly where it had been, unremarkable, still, as if it had done nothing at all. Harold approached it again. His steps were quieter now, more certain. He sat down. The chair creaked softly beneath him. For a long moment he did nothing. Then he reached out. His hand rested on the switch. He didn't press it, not yet. His fingers remained there, still, as if waiting, not for courage, but for permission. None came, only silence, deep, patient, unmoving, and yet, somewhere within it, there was a sense, faint, unprovable, but present, as if something far beyond the room had already begun speaking again, and was only waiting for him to listen. Evening settled slowly over the town, not as a sudden dimming, but as a quiet agreement between light and shadow. The sky deepened in colour. The edges of things softened, and the wind lost its earlier restlessness, moving now with a kind of restraint, as if aware of something it should not disturb. Harold remained in the workshop. He had not turned on the radio. Not yet. The room had grown darker, the last of the daylight slipping through the window in long fading lines that stretched across the floor and up the legs of the table. Dust drifted in the air, barely visible, suspended between motion and stillness. Time passed, measured not by clocks, but by the slow retreat of light. Harold sat with his hands folded loosely, his gaze resting somewhere between the radio and the far wall. He wasn't thinking, not in any structured way. Thoughts came, but they didn't stay. They moved through him like distant weather, leaving only a trace behind. But beneath them, something else remained. Expectation, not sharp, not urgent, just present. He didn't know why. He only knew it hadn't been there before. Outside, somewhere far down the road, a car passed. The sound reached the house faintly, then faded just as quickly, leaving the silence deeper than before. Harold looked at the radio. Still off, still quiet. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "What do you want?" he asked softly. The question wasn't meant for the machine, and yet it felt as though it had somewhere to go. No answer came, of course not. He almost smiled. Almost. Then, without fully deciding to, he reached out. Click. The radio came alive again. A low hum filled the room, then static. Quieter than before, more focused, as if it had already found a frequency and was waiting for something else to align. Harold didn't touch the dial. He let it be. The sound shifted on its own. Barely, subtly, a thinning, a narrowing. The static began to breathe, in, and then a tone, faint, almost musical. It hovered at the edge of perception, unstable but distinct. Harold's chest tightened. He didn't move, didn't reach, didn't adjust. He listened. The tone grew clearer, and beneath it, something else, not a voice, not yet, but a structure, a pattern, like the beginning of a song remembered before the words return. Then, piano, soft, distant, each note slightly blurred, as if carried across too much time. Harold closed his eyes. He knew it, not consciously, not immediately, but his body recognized it before his mind did. The spacing of the notes, the hesitation between them, the way the melody leaned forward, then pulled back. It was incomplete, but familiar, painfully so. The music flickered, threatened to disappear, then steadied, and with it a voice not speaking, humming, low, close, not distant any more, not unreachable, present. Harold's breath caught. His hand tightened slightly against his knee. The humming shifted, just enough for the melody to align. And suddenly he was somewhere else, not in the workshop, not in the dimming light, but in a different room, warmer, brighter, a window open to summer air, curtains moving gently, and a woman, not fully seen, but known, always known. The radio crackled, the image faltered, returned. "You always play it too slow." The voice was clearer now, still fragile but unmistakable, young, alive. Harold opened his eyes. The workshop returned around him, but it felt thinner, less certain. "It's supposed to breathe," the voice continued softly. "You don't let it breathe." A faint laugh followed, light, unburdened. Harold's throat tightened. He leaned forward without realizing it. "Margaret," he said. The name barely left his lips, but it changed something. The signal sharpened, just slightly. "There," she said. "That's better?" The words overlapped with something unseen. Another presence, just out of reach. A memory trying to take shape. Harold's hands trembled, not visibly, but enough that he felt it. "I remember," he whispered. Static surged, then receded. The piano faded, the humming broke apart, and the voice gone, just like that. The room filled again with noise, unfocused, empty. Harold sat frozen. The moment stretched, collapsed, left behind only its outline. He reached for the dial, stopped, because something in him understood now. It wasn't something to control. It wasn't something to fix. It came when it came. He leaned back slowly. The chair creaked beneath him. The radio continued its quiet, restless breathing, but it no longer felt random. It felt searching. Harold looked toward the window. Night had settled fully now. The glass reflected the room back at him, the table, the chair, the radio, and himself, older, still, watching. He held that reflection for a moment, then looked away, because what he had just heard wasn't just a voice, it was a moment, one he had lived, one he had lost, and now, somehow, one that was returning, not whole, not yet, but enough to remember something he hadn't allowed himself to in years, not just her voice, but how it felt, to be someone she spoke to that way, to be someone she stayed with, to be someone who had still had a choice. Harold reached out. Click. The radio fell silent. This time the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt marked, as if something had been placed within it, something that would not leave. He sat there for a long time, listening, not for the radio, but for what it had brought back with it. And somewhere, deep beneath memory, a question began to form, not about what he was hearing, but about what he had done when he had heard it the first time. Morning came quietly, as it always did. The light arrived first, thin, pale, almost hesitant, slipping through the curtains and resting gently across the floor. It didn't wake the house so much as reveal it again, piece by piece, as if assembling it from memory. Harold was already awake. He hadn't slept much, not because he couldn't, but because something in him had resisted it. Every time his eyes closed, the music returned, not fully, not clearly, just fragments, the spacing of notes, the warmth of a voice, the shape of a moment that refused to stay in the past. He sat at the kitchen table, the same cup in his hands, the same quiet around him. But it wasn't the same. Nothing was. The tea had gone cold. He hadn't noticed when. Outside a bird called once, then again. The sound lingered longer than it should have. Harold stared at the surface of the tea, still, unmoving, like the past had once seemed. He stood slowly, leaving the cup behind. The workshop waited. It always had, but now it felt different, not just a place, but a threshold. He paused at the doorway, just for a moment, then stepped inside. The radio sat where it always had, unchanged, ordinary, as if the night before had never happened. Harold approached it carefully, as though sudden movement might disturb something unseen. He didn't turn it on, not yet. Instead, he looked around the room, at the tools, the shelves, the small details that had remained constant for years, and then his gaze stopped on something he hadn't noticed in a long time, a photograph. It rested half-hidden behind a stack of old manuals on the far shelf. He moved toward it slowly, as if approaching something fragile. He picked it up. The edges were worn, the surface faded just enough to soften the details without erasing them. A younger man stood in the frame. Beside him, a woman, Margaret. The recognition came immediately, not from the image, but from somewhere deeper. She was turned slightly toward him, not the camera, as if the moment had been captured just before she said something, or just after. There was light in her expression, not brightness, not laughter, something quieter, warmer, certain. Harold's thumb brushed lightly against the edge of the photograph. You always play it too slow. The memory returned, not from the radio this time, but from within, clearer, closer. He closed his eyes. For a second the room shifted again. The workshop thinned, the past pressed closer, not enough to take over, but enough to blur the line. He opened his eyes, and for the first time he noticed something else in the corner of the photograph. A date, small, faded, but still there. September. He inhaled slowly, held it. September. The words settled differently now. Not just a time, a point, a boundary. You promised you'd be back before fall. The voice from the first signal. The words returned with it, not as sound, as meaning. Harold's hand tightened slightly around the photograph. He set it down carefully, not where it had been, closer, near the radio, as if placing it in relation to something that needed to see it or hear it. A knock sounded faintly in the distance. Harold didn't react at first. The sound felt misplaced, disconnected. Then, again, real, present. He turned. The house reassembled around him. The workshop, the light, the door. He walked through the hallway slowly, the photograph still lingering in his mind, its presence sharper than the objects around him. When he opened the door, Ethan stood there, Lena beside him. The morning light framed them differently than the day before, clearer, less uncertain. But something had changed in all of them. "You heard it again," Lena said. It wasn't a question. Harold nodded once. "Yes." Ethan stepped forward slightly. "Last night?" "Yes." "What did it say?" Harold looked at him, then at Lena. "It didn't start with words," he said. Lena's expression softened. "It started with music." Ethan frowned. "Music?" Harold nodded. "A piano." Lena glanced briefly at Ethan, then back at Harold. And then, a pause, then, she spoke. The air held. "What did she say?" Lena asked. Harold hesitated, not because he didn't remember, but because saying it would fix it, make it undeniable. "She told me I was playing it too slow," he said. Ethan blinked. "That's specific." "Yes." Lena stepped inside without waiting to be invited. Ethan followed. The door remained open behind them for a moment longer before closing softly on its own. They moved into the workshop together. The radio sat where it had been, but now there was something else. The photograph. Lena noticed it immediately. She stepped closer, picking it up carefully. "Is this her?" she asked. Harold nodded. Ethan leaned in slightly. "She looks—" He didn't finish, because whatever he was about to say didn't fit. Lena studied the image. "There's something unfinished here," she said quietly. Ethan glanced at her. "It's a photograph." "No," she said. "Not that." She looked up at Harold. "This wasn't the end, was it?" Silence. Then, "No." The word landed softly, but it carried weight. Ethan folded his arms. "So the radio is playing back? What? Moments before something happened? Or moments that never finished happening?" Lena said. He looked at her. "That doesn't make sense." She met his gaze. "Neither does any of this." He didn't argue because she was right. Again, Harold stepped closer to the table. The photograph, the radio, side by side now, past and present aligned in a way that felt intentional. He reached out, not to the photograph, to the switch. His fingers paused there. The room held its breath. Lena watched him. "Try," she said softly. Ethan said nothing. Harold pressed the switch. Click. The radio came alive, static, low, measured, different. Not searching this time, waiting. The three of them stood close now, closer than before, not physically, but in something else, expectation. The sound shifted, slowly, deliberately, like something approaching a point it had already reached once before, and then a voice, clearer than any before. "Harry?" Harold's breath stopped, not because of the sound, but because of what came with it. Time, not passing, but folding. "Why didn't you come back?" The question entered the room and did not leave. Lena felt it in her chest. Ethan felt it in the silence that followed. But Harold felt it where memory and regret meet, and for the first time. The radio wasn't just bringing something back. It was asking for an answer. No one moved. The question lingered in the air, not as sound but as presence, something that had weight, direction, intention. "Why didn't you come back?" The radio crackled softly beneath it, as if the signal itself were holding steady just long enough to let the words exist fully. Harold stood very still, too still. His eyes remained fixed on the radio, but it was clear he wasn't seeing it. Not really. The room had already begun to recede for him, its edges loosening, its details thinning under the pressure of something much older. Ethan shifted first. Not much, just enough to break the paralysis. "That's," he began, then stopped, because there was no word for it. Not interference, not coincidence, not anything he understood. Lena stepped closer to Harold. She didn't touch him, but she stood near enough that the distance between them felt intentional. "Can you answer?" she asked quietly. Harold didn't respond. The radio hissed faintly. Then, nothing. The signal did not continue. It didn't repeat. It didn't fade out gradually. It simply stopped, as if it had said exactly what it needed to. Silence filled the space, dense, unforgiving. Ethan exhaled slowly. "That wasn't a recording," he said. No one argued, because now that explanation had nowhere left to stand. Lena kept her gaze on Harold. "You heard her," she said softly. It wasn't a question. It was an anchor, something to hold on to. Harold's lips parted slightly, but no words came. Not yet. His throat tightened, as if the act of speaking required crossing something he had spent years avoiding. He began, stopped. The word dissolved before it could take shape. Lena didn't press. She waited. Ethan didn't. "What does she mean?" he asked. "You said you knew her. You said—" "I know what I said," Harold replied quietly. The interruption was gentle, but firm. Ethan fell silent. Harold's gaze lowered slightly, not to the floor, but somewhere in between, somewhere internal. "She asked me that once before," he said. The words came slowly now, carefully, as if each one had to be placed. "When?" Lena asked. Harold inhaled, held it. "After I left." The room seemed to narrow. "Left where?" Ethan said. Harold's fingers moved faintly against the edge of the table. "Here," he said. "This town?" Ethan frowned. "You moved away?" "For a while." "How long is a while?" Harold didn't answer immediately. Lena spoke instead. "Long enough," she said. Harold nodded slightly. "Yes." Ethan looked between them. "That still doesn't explain—" "It doesn't," Harold said, "but it's part of it." Silence returned, but now it was different. Not empty, layered. The radio remained quiet, but it no longer felt inactive. It felt attentive, as if listening back. Harold reached out slowly and rested his hand on the table, not on the radio itself, but close enough to feel its presence. "I told her I would come back," he said. Lena closed her eyes briefly. The words fit too easily. "You promised you'd be back before fall." The first voice, the first signal, it aligned now, not as fragments, as a line. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "And you didn't?" Harold's jaw tightened. "No. Why?" The question came too quickly, too directly. Lena glanced at Ethan, but didn't stop him. Because the question had already been asked, long before this moment. Harold didn't answer right away. His gaze lifted slightly, drifting toward the photograph on the table. Margaret, frozen in a moment that hadn't yet known what was coming. "I thought I had time," he said. Ethan exhaled quietly. "That's not a reason." Harold's expression didn't change. "No," he agreed, "it isn't." Lena stepped closer to the photograph. Her fingers hovered just above it, not touching. "What happened?" she asked. Harold's eyes remained on the image. "I stayed away longer than I should have." "How long?" He hesitated then. "Until it didn't matter any more." The words landed heavily. Ethan looked at him. "That doesn't make sense." "It does," Lena said quietly. He turned to her. "No, it doesn't. Things don't just stop mattering." She met his gaze. "They do when there's no one left to matter to." The silence that followed was different, sharper. Ethan looked away. Harold closed his eyes again. Not to escape, but to see more clearly. "I came back," he said. Lena's breath caught slightly. "When?" "After." "After." The word carried everything it didn't say. Ethan didn't speak, for once. Harold opened his eyes again. "She asked me that," he said, his voice quieter now. "Why didn't you come back?" The room seemed to tilt, time folding inward, repeating, not perfectly, but enough. "And I didn't answer her," he added. The admission settled deeply. Lena looked at the radio. "Now she's asking again." Ethan shook his head slightly. "That's not possible." But the words lacked resistance. Lena didn't respond, because possibility had already shifted. Harold looked at the radio. Then, slowly, he moved closer, not rushed, not hesitant, certain. He reached out. His fingers hovered over the switch. Ethan watched him. "What are you doing?" Harold didn't look at him. "She asked a question," he said. "And you think it's going to answer again," Ethan said. Harold shook his head slightly. "No." "Then what?" A pause. Then, "I think it's waiting." Lena's voice was barely above a whisper. "For what?" Harold's hand steadied. "For me." The room held, no movement, no sound, only the weight of what had already been said and what had not. Ethan took a step forward. "You don't have to—" "Yes," Harold said, not loud, but final. Ethan stopped. Lena didn't move. She understood. This wasn't about the radio. Not anymore. Harold pressed the switch. Click. The radio came alive again. Static, brief, then thinning, then silence, not empty, expectant, and then the voice returned, clear, closer than before. "Harry?" Harold didn't hesitate this time. "I didn't come back," he said. The words left him before he could measure them, before he could soften them. They entered the space, raw, unprotected. The radio responded, not immediately, but unmistakably, a shift, a recognition, and then I waited. The voice didn't accuse, didn't rise, it simply stated, and that made it worse. Harold's hand tightened against the table. "I know," he said. Silence, then, "Why?" The same question, but deeper now, not about absence, about choice. Harold's breath faltered. Ethan stood motionless. Lena watched him, not the radio him, because this was the moment, not when the voice appeared, but when it asked something that couldn't be avoided. Harold closed his eyes, and for the first time, he didn't reach for explanation. He didn't reach for time, he reached for truth. "I was afraid," he said. The words settled into the room, and everything, the radio, the silence, the past, shifted to make space for what came next. The word lingered, afraid. It did not echo. It did not fade. It simply remained, solid, irreversible, occupying the space between what had been lived and what had never been said. The radio did not respond immediately. For a moment, it seemed as though the signal had withdrawn, as if the admission itself had altered something fundamental, shifted the balance between past and present. Harold stood unmoving. His hand rested against the edge of the table, fingers tense, as though holding himself in place. The room felt thinner now, stretched across something fragile. Ethan didn't speak. For once, there was no explanation waiting behind his silence. Lena watched Harold, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with a quiet steadiness, as if this moment needed to unfold without interference. The radio crackled, softly. Then, "Of what?" The voice returned, not louder, not closer, but clearer. There was no accusation in it, no anger, only something more difficult to bear, a need to understand. Harold swallowed. His throat felt dry, because the answer was not simple, not any more. "I thought," he began, stopped. The old habit, the instinct to soften, to reshape. He exhaled slowly, then tried again. "I thought if I came back, everything would have to be real." The words felt incomplete, but he continued, "That I would have to choose." The radio held, listening. "You already did," the voice replied. The statement fell gently, but it landed with precision. Ethan shifted his weight slightly. Lena's gaze didn't leave Harold. He nodded once. "Yes," he said, "I did." Silence, but not empty. The kind that waits, not for sound, but for something deeper to surface. Harold's eyes drifted toward the photograph. Margaret, still there, still young, still in that moment before anything had been decided. "I left because it was easier," he said. The admission came without resistance this time. "I told myself it wasn't permanent, that I would come back when things were clearer." The radio hissed faintly. "And were they?" the voice asked. Harold almost smiled, a tired, quiet movement that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No," he said. The truth settled heavily. "They never are." The static shifted, not louder, but more present, as if the space between them was narrowing. "You didn't write," the voice said. The words were softer now, closer. Harold's jaw tightened slightly. "I tried," he said. "Once." The room seemed to react, not physically, but perceptually, as if something inside it recognized the weight of that word. "Once." "You stopped," she said, not a question. Harold nodded. "Yes. Why?" The repetition of the question did not feel redundant. It felt necessary, because answers built on each other, layer by layer. Harold looked down at his hands. They were steady now, more than they had been. "Because the longer I waited," he said slowly, "the harder it became to explain why I hadn't come back." Lena felt something shift inside her, recognition, not of the situation, but of the pattern. Ethan leaned back slightly, arms folded, though not defensively any more, just holding himself there. "And then," Harold continued, "it became easier to say nothing." The radio fell silent. Completely. For a moment it seemed as though the connection had broken, that the thread had been pulled too far. Lena stepped closer. "Wait." But then a sound, not static, not voice, something else, a breath, faint, almost imperceptible, and then, "I thought you changed your mind." The words came slowly, carefully, as if shaped by something fragile. Harold's eyes closed. "I didn't," he said, but even as he spoke, something in his expression shifted, because that wasn't entirely true, not in the way it mattered. The radio responded, not with words, with silence, a silence that held, that asked, that refused to accept something incomplete. Harold opened his eyes again, and this time he didn't look at the radio. He looked at the photograph, at the version of her that still existed there, waiting, unaware. "I didn't change my mind about you," he said. The distinction mattered. It changed the shape of everything. "I changed my mind about what I was willing to face." The words settled, more precise, more honest. Lena's breath caught slightly. Ethan didn't move. The radio crackled once, soft, then, "You should have told me." There it was, not anger, not accusation, just truth, simple, unavoidable. Harold nodded slowly. "I know." Silence, but now it felt different, not heavy, not suffocating, open, as if something had shifted, not resolved, but acknowledged. The radio sound softened, the static less erratic now, more distant, as if the connection were no longer straining to hold. Lena spoke quietly. What happened to her? The question entered the space carefully, respectfully. Harold didn't answer right away, because this part wasn't just memory, it was consequence. "She didn't wait forever," he said. Ethan looked at him. "Did she leave?" Harold shook his head. "No." A pause. Then, "She got sick." The words were simple, too simple for what they carried. Lena's eyes lowered slightly. "And you didn't know?" Harold's gaze remained on the photograph. Not until it was too late. The silence that followed was different from all the others, not filled with tension, not filled with expectation, but with something quieter. Grief, not sharp, not new, but present, still. After all this time, the radio did not respond. It didn't need to, because the answer, the real one, had already been given. Harold stood there, breathing slowly. The room around him felt more solid now, less distorted, as if the act of speaking had anchored something that had been drifting for years. Lena stepped back slightly, giving the moment space. Ethan looked at the radio, then at Harold. "So what now?" he asked. Harold didn't answer immediately. He reached out, rested his hand gently on the radio, not to control it, not to activate it, just to acknowledge it. "I don't think it's finished," he said. Lena nodded. "No," she said softly, "it isn't, because this wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what had never been said while there was still time to say it." The radio did not speak again that day. It remained on for a while, breathing its quiet, uneven static into the room. But the voice did not return. Eventually, the sound thinned into something almost imperceptible, and Harold turned it off without ceremony. No one suggested leaving. Not immediately. They stayed in the workshop as the light shifted once more, as afternoon leaned toward evening again, repeating the slow, patient rhythm of the day before. But nothing felt repetitive anymore. Everything felt aligned, not resolved, but moving. Ethan stood near the doorway now, his shoulder resting lightly against the frame. He wasn't watching the radio anymore. He was watching Harold, or maybe what Harold had become in the last hour. "You could have come back," Ethan said finally. The words weren't sharp, but they weren't soft either. They existed somewhere in between, honest, unfiltered. Harold didn't react right away. "I know," he said. Ethan frowned slightly. "That's it." Harold turned toward him. "What else would you like me to say?" Ethan hesitated, then, "I don't know. Something that makes it make sense." Harold's expression didn't harden, but something in it steadied. "It doesn't," he said. Silence followed. Ethan looked away because he recognized the truth in that and didn't like it. Lena sat on the edge of the workbench, her hands loosely folded in her lap. She had been quiet for some time now, but it wasn't withdrawal. It was listening, not to the room, not to the radio, to something beneath both. "You're not the same person now," she said softly. Harold glanced at her. "No," he agreed. "Then why does it still feel like you are?" she asked. The question lingered, not accusatory, not confrontational, just precise. Harold didn't answer immediately, because it wasn't simple, because time changed things, but not everything. "Because some things don't move with time," he said finally. Lena nodded slightly. "Like what?" Harold looked at the radio, then at the photograph. "Choices," he said. The words settled into the room. Ethan exhaled quietly. "So what? This thing," he gestured toward the radio, "is giving you a chance to change that?" Harold shook his head. "No." "Then what is it doing?" A pause. Then, "is asking me to understand it." Ethan frowned. "That's not enough." Harold met his gaze. "It has to be." The simplicity of the answer left no room to argue. And yet, Ethan still felt the resistance, because understanding didn't undo anything, didn't fix anything, didn't bring anyone back. Lena spoke again, more quietly now. "But maybe it changes what comes after." Ethan looked at her. "What comes after what?" She didn't answer right away, because the question wasn't about time. It was about people. Instead, she looked at Harold. "What did you do when you came back?" she asked. Harold's gaze lowered slightly. "I stayed. That's all." He nodded. "Yes. You didn't try to find her." The question was gentle, but it carried weight. Harold's hand moved slightly against the table. "I did. And?" He inhaled slowly. She was already gone. The words came easier now, not because they hurt less, but because they had already been spoken once. Lena's eyes softened. "And after that?" Harold looked around the room, at the tools, the walls, the years. "I didn't leave again," he said. Ethan let out a quiet breath. "That's not the same as staying." Harold didn't argue. "No," he said, "it isn't." Silence settled again, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt open, as if the room itself had made space for something new to exist within it. Lena slid off the workbench and stepped closer to the table. She looked at the radio, then at Harold. "You're still afraid," she said. Not a question, a recognition. Harold didn't deny it. "Yes." Ethan shook his head slightly. "Of what? It already happened." Lena glanced at him. "That doesn't make it easier." He didn't respond, because part of him knew that, even if he didn't want to. Harold rested his hand lightly on the table again. "Before," he said, "I was afraid of what would happen if I came back." A pause. "Now I'm afraid of what it means that I didn't." The distinction hung in the air, clear, unavoidable. Lena nodded slowly. "That's closer," she said. Ethan looked between them. "I don't get it," he admitted. Lena turned to him. "You don't have to yet. That's not helpful." "No," she said gently. "It's honest." He looked away, toward the window. The light had dimmed again. Evening returning, like it always did, like it always would. Things don't wait, he said after a moment. Lena followed his gaze. No, she said, they don't. Harold looked at them both, and for the first time he saw something clearly, not in the radio, not in the past, in them. Two people standing in a moment that still had direction, that still had possibility, that had not yet hardened into something unchangeable. You should go, he said. Ethan turned back. What? Harold's voice remained calm. Not now, he clarified. Not from here. A pause. But from this place. Ethan frowned. What are you talking about? Harold looked at Lena, then at Ethan. You're both standing in something that hasn't closed yet, he said, and that matters more than anything this radio is doing. The words settled, not as instruction, as recognition. Lena's expression shifted slightly, not surprised, but acknowledged. Ethan didn't respond right away, because he understood, just enough for it to make him uncomfortable. That's not the same, he said finally. No, Harold agreed, it isn't. But it's not unrelated. Silence followed. Then Lena spoke softly. We'll come back tomorrow. Harold nodded once. Yes. Ethan hesitated then. Yeah. They moved toward the door. Slower than before, not reluctant, but aware. The air outside had cooled, the light nearly gone. As they stepped out, Lena paused briefly. She looked back at Harold, at the house, at the space that now held something more than it had before. Don't stop listening, she said. Harold met her gaze. I won't. She nodded, then turned. The door closed, and once again Harold was alone, but not in the same way. He stood in the quiet of the workshop, the radio silent, the photograph still resting beside it, the light fading into night. He didn't turn the radio on, not yet, because something had shifted, not in the signal, in him. For the first time, he wasn't waiting to hear her again. He was waiting to know what he would say when she did. That night did not arrive all at once. It gathered, slowly, in the spaces between objects, in the corners of the room, in the quiet stretches where light had once rested and now withdrew. The house dimmed in layers, as if remembering how to be dark. Harold did not turn on the lamp. He let the shadow settle. The workshop existed now in half-light. The outline of the table, the faint suggestion of the radio, the photograph barely visible where it lay. The window had become a mirror, reflecting the room back into itself, doubling the stillness. He sat in the same chair, but he was not the same, not after what had been said, not after what had been heard. His hands rested loosely in his lap, no longer tense, no longer searching for something to hold. The need to reach, to control, to adjust, to interpret, had quieted. In its place, something steadier, not peace, but readiness. Outside the wind moved again, softer now, brushing against the walls with a low continuous sound. Somewhere distant, something metallic shifted once, then fell silent. Time moved, measured now not in hours, but in expectation. Harold looked at the radio, still dark, still silent, and yet it did not feel inactive. It felt aware, as if the boundary between then and now had thinned enough that it no longer required effort to cross. He leaned forward slightly, not abruptly, not hesitantly, just enough. His hand moved toward the switch. This time he didn't pause. Click. The radio came alive. No surge of static, no searching frequencies. only a low, steady hum, and then silence, but not empty, held, like a breath waiting to be released. Harold didn't move, didn't speak. He waited. The air in the room felt different, denser, not oppressive, but present, and then a sound, not static, not voice, a door, faint, distant, opening. Harold's chest tightened because he knew that sound, not from memory alone, from place, from time, from a moment that had not been revisited in years. Footsteps followed, soft, measured, approaching. The radio did not distort them, did not fracture them. It carried them, intact. And then a voice, clear, closer than ever before. You came back. Not a question, not surprise. Something quieter, relief, held carefully. Harold's breath caught. His hand trembled slightly, but he did not pull away. I did, he said. The words came easier now, not because they were simple, but because he no longer tried to shape them. The radio held, the presence remained. You're late, she said. There was no accusation in it, no bitterness, just truth, simple, undeniable. Harold nodded. I know. Silence followed, but it was not the same silence as before. It was shared, occupied, alive. He closed his eyes, and for a moment the workshop dissolved, not completely, but enough. The air changed, warmer, carrying something faint. Summer. Light moved differently, not filtered, not distant, direct, and in that light he could almost see her, not fully, not clearly, but enough to know where she stood, how she held herself, the way she always paused before speaking, as if choosing not just words, but meaning. I didn't think you would, she said. Harold opened his eyes. The room returned, but the presence remained. I didn't either, he said. The admission was quiet, but it carried something new, not regret, not explanation, something closer to recognition. The radio hummed faintly beneath the silence. Why now? She asked. The question was different this time, not about the past, about this moment, about the crossing. Harold didn't answer right away, because this was not something he had prepared, not something he had rehearsed. He looked at the photograph, then at the radio, then not at either, at the space between. Because I finally understand what I didn't then, he said. The words settled carefully, the signal held, listening. And what is that? She asked. Harold inhaled slowly, then, that not choosing was still a choice. The room seemed to shift, not physically, but perceptually, as if something long unspoken had finally taken form. The radio responded, not with sound, with presence, a closeness. You left me in it, she said. The words were soft, but they did not avoid anything. Harold's eyes lowered slightly. Yes. He didn't try to explain, didn't try to soften, because there was no version of it that changed what it had been. The silence that followed was different, not heavy, not sharp, but full, as if both of them stood inside it, not as memory, as something shared. I waited, she said again. This time the words were not new, but they were not repetition. They were grounding, placing the moment where it had always been. Harold nodded. I know. A pause, then, You're here now. The statement was simple, but it changed everything, because it wasn't about what had been lost. It was about what was present. Harold looked up, even though there was nothing to see. I am. Silence, then something unexpected. A shift in tone, not lighter, but open. What will you do with it? She asked. The question did not belong to the past. It belonged to now. Harold felt it immediately, the weight of it, the direction of it, because this was not about answering what had already happened. It was about what remained. He didn't answer right away, because this was the first question that did not already have an answer inside it. He looked at the radio, at the photograph, at the room, then beyond them, to something that extended past this moment, past this house, past this time. I don't know, he said honestly. The admission did not weaken the space, it steadied it. That's new, she said softly. Harold almost smiled. Yes, the radio hummed, the presence remained, but something had shifted. Not closure, not yet, but movement, a direction that had not existed before. The connection did not break, it did not vanish, it simply held, as if waiting for something else, something that had not yet been asked or answered, and Harold understood now. This was not the end of the conversation. It was the point where it became something more than memory. Morning arrived with wind, not strong, just enough to move the edges of things. The grass leaned, the loose green on the porch tapped lightly against its frame, and the air carried a cooler note than the day before. Ethan stood outside his truck longer than he needed to. The engine was off, the keys were still in his hand. He hadn't moved. Lena waited by the fence a few steps away, watching him without saying anything. "You're thinking too much again," she said finally. Ethan exhaled. "I'm thinking just enough. That's usually too much for you." He glanced at her. "Why are you so calm about this?" "I'm not calm," she said. "I'm just not trying to force it into something it isn't." He leaned back slightly against the truck. "And what is it then?" Lena looked toward the road, then past it, toward the house they hadn't yet reached. "I think it's a moment that didn't finish," she said. Ethan frowned. "That doesn't explain anything." "No," she agreed. "But it's closer than pretending it's a broken signal." He looked down at his hands. The key shifted slightly between his fingers. "What if it is just that?" he said. "Something electrical. Something we don't understand yet." Lena tilted her head. "Then why does it feel like it understands us?" He didn't answer. "Because that was the part he couldn't explain away." She stepped closer. "You don't have to believe in it," she said. "You just have to see what it's doing." Ethan looked at her. "And what is it doing?" Lena held his gaze. "It's asking questions you don't want to answer." He let out a quiet breath. "That's not just it." "No," she said softly. "It's not." They stood there for a moment longer. The wind moved again. The day didn't wait. Ethan straightened. "Let's go," he said. The house looked the same. It always would. That was part of what made it unsettling. Nothing about it reflected what had already happened inside. The porch, the chair, the faded blue door. Still. Quiet, as if untouched, but the air around it felt different now. Not heavier, just aware. Ethan stepped onto the porch first this time. The wood creaked beneath his weight. He didn't hesitate. He knocked, once, firm. The sound carried. Lena stood just behind him, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her sweater. They didn't wait long. The door opened. Harold stood there. Something had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that could be named immediately, but it was there, in the way he held himself, in the way he looked at them, less distant, more present. "You came back," he said. Lena smiled faintly. We said we would. Ethan nodded. Yeah. Harold stepped aside. Come in. They entered. The house felt different too. Not rearranged, not brighter, but inhabited in a way it hadn't been before, as if something had moved through it and left a trace. They walked into the workshop together. The radio sat where it always had, the photograph beside it unchanged, and yet everything around it felt altered. Ethan looked at Harold. It happened again, he said. Not a question. Harold nodded. Yes. Lena stepped closer to the table. How much did you hear? Harold considered the question. Then, enough. Ethan frowned slightly. That's not an answer. Harold looked at him. It's the only one that matters. Silence settled briefly. Then Lena asked, What did she say? Harold didn't look at the radio this time. He looked at them. At me, he said. Ethan blinked. What do you mean? I mean it wasn't just about what happened anymore. Lena's expression shifted slightly. Then what was it about? Harold paused, as if choosing the shape of something that had no simple form. What comes after? He said. The words landed differently. Ethan crossed his arms. After what? Harold met his gaze. After you understand what you did. Ethan didn't respond, because that was not something he had expected. Lena looked at the radio. Did you answer? She asked. Harold nodded. Yes. And? A pause. Then, I didn't know what to say. Ethan let out a quiet breath. So you just, what, stood there? Harold shook his head slightly. No. Then what? I told the truth. The simplicity of it made Ethan hesitate. What truth? Harold's gaze drifted briefly toward the photograph, then back. That I don't know what to do with it. Lena nodded slowly. That makes sense. Ethan looked at her. It does. Yes. How? She turned to him. Because knowing doesn't automatically give you direction. He frowned. Then what's the point? Lena held his gaze. To stop pretending you didn't choose. The words settled, quiet but precise. Ethan looked away, toward the window. The light outside was clearer now than the day before, sharper, less forgiving. Harold stepped closer to the table. He rested his hand near the radio, not touching it, just close. It's different now, he said. Lena glanced at him. How? It's not just repeating anymore. Ethan turned back. What does that mean? Harold looked at the radio, then at them. It's waiting for something that hasn't happened yet. The room stilled, not dramatically, but enough. Lena spoke softly. For you? Harold shook his head. No. A pause. Then, for all of us. Ethan let out a small, uncertain breath. That doesn't make sense. Harold didn't argue. It doesn't have to. Lena stepped closer. Her gaze moved between the radio and Harold. What happens if you don't answer? She asked. Harold didn't hesitate. It will stay unfinished. Ethan shifted slightly. And if you do? A longer pause. Then, I don't know. Silence followed. But it wasn't empty. It felt like something building. Not pressure, potential. Lena looked at Ethan, then back at Harold. Then maybe it's not just about finishing what was, she said. Harold watched her. Maybe it's about choosing what comes next. The words held. Ethan didn't speak. Because something in them unsettled him. Not because they were wrong, but because they were too close. The radio remained silent, but it no longer felt inactive. It felt aligned, as if it had reached the point where the past had said everything it could, and now it was waiting for the present to answer. The radio did not come on by itself. It waited. The three of them stood in the workshop, the air between them quieter than it had ever been. Not empty, not uncertain, but charged with something that had been building slowly, patiently, across every word, every silence, every return. Harold stood closest to the table. Ethan lingered near the doorway. Lena stood between them, not physically centered, but in something else, awareness. The photograph rested beside the radio. Margaret, still turned slightly away from the camera, still caught in that almost moment, as if she might speak if given just a second more. The light in the room had shifted again, midday now, but softened by thin clouds passing overhead. Shadows moved slowly across the walls, drifting rather than cutting. Time was still moving, but it no longer felt like something slipping away. It felt like something arriving. Lena broke the silence. "Turn it on," she said. Her voice was calm, not urging, not hesitant, certain. Harold looked at her, then at Ethan. Ethan gave a small nod, not because he understood, but because he didn't want to stand outside it any more. Harold reached out. His hand didn't tremble this time. Click. The radio came alive. No static, no searching, only a low, steady hum. And then sound, immediate, clear, as if it had already been waiting. Wind, soft, moving through something open. Leaves, distant, and then a door, the same moment, but closer now, more complete. Harold felt it instantly, not as memory, as presence. "Harry?" Her voice, clearer than ever before, not distant, not fractured. "Here." Lena's breath slowed. Ethan didn't move. "You came back." The same words as before, but different now, because this time they weren't being remembered, they were being lived. Harold stepped closer, not toward the radio, into the moment. "I did," he said. The response came without hesitation, without weight, because now he wasn't answering the past. He was standing inside it. The air shifted, the room thinned, the workshop loosened its hold. And for a brief, fragile span, the boundary gave way. Light changed, warmer, fuller. The outline of something beyond the room began to form. Not solid, not complete, but enough. A doorway, open, summer light beyond it, and a figure, not fully seen, but unmistakable. Margaret, not as memory, not as voice, as presence. Ethan felt it in his chest, tight, unfamiliar. Lena didn't look away. "You're late," she said, the same words, but this time they carried something else, not just truth, choice. Harold nodded. "I know." Silence, but not empty, full, alive, the moment held, not repeating, waiting, and then she spoke again. "Are you staying?" The question landed differently than anything before, not about what had happened, not about why, about now, about this moment, about what he would do with the chance he never took. Harold felt it fully, the weight, the opening, the impossibility of it, because this was not memory anymore. This was the edge of something that could change, not the past, but its meaning. Ethan took a step forward, almost without realizing it. Lena reached out slightly, not to stop him, but to ground him. This wasn't his moment, not yet. Harold stood still. The doorway before him, the room behind him, the life he had lived, the one he had not, all present, all possible, for a single fragile span of time. He looked at her, at the shape of her in the light, at the version of himself reflected in that moment, and then he spoke. "No," he said. The word entered the space gently, without force, without regret. "I can't stay." The light shifted, not collapsing, not disappearing, changing, the moment adjusted around the truth. "Why?" she asked, not wounded, not surprised, just asking, as she always had. Harold stepped forward, but not into the doorway, just close enough to feel its warmth. "Because this isn't where I am anymore," he said. The words came clearly, fully. "For a long time I thought not coming back meant I lost everything." A pause. "But I didn't." The air held. "I carried it with me," he continued, badly, quietly, without understanding it. Lena felt her chest tighten. Ethan watched him, not as the old man he had first seen, but as someone standing in something real. "I can't change what I did," Harold said, "but I can choose what it means now." The silence that followed was not empty. It was receiving. Margaret's presence remained, steady, unbroken. "And what does it mean?" she asked. Harold looked at her, truly looked, not as memory, not as regret, as something that had been real and still was. "It means I loved you," he said. The words settled, simple, complete, and I didn't understand what that required. A breath. But I do now. The light softened, not fading, not closing, just shifting. "That's late," she said quietly. Harold nodded. "Yes." A small pause. Then, "But it's true." Silence, deep, still, and then something changed. Not in the room, in the space between them. A release, subtle but unmistakable. Not forgiveness, not resolution. Something quieter, acceptance. Margaret's presence didn't move closer, didn't fade. It simply settled. "Then stay where you are," she said. The words were soft, but final. "Be there." Harold inhaled slowly, and for the first time the breath didn't catch, didn't resist. It moved freely. "I will," he said. The moment held. Then, gently, it began to dissolve. Not abruptly, not breaking, unfolding. The light thinned, the doorway softened. The shape of her became less defined, not gone, just no longer here. The radio's hum returned, low, steady. The workshop came back into place, solid, present, complete. Ethan exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Lena lowered her hand. The space around them felt different now, not charged, not tense, open. Harold stood still, not reaching, not holding on, just there. The radio remained on, but it no longer searched, it no longer called, it simply existed, and for the first time it felt like it had finished what it came to do. The radio stayed silent the next morning, not broken, not empty, just quiet, the kind of quiet that no longer asks for anything. Light moved slowly through the house, touching familiar surfaces without changing them. The kitchen, the hallway, the workshop, everything remained where it had always been. But something had shifted, not in the objects, in how they were held. Harold stood by the window for a long time before moving. Outside, the wind carried the same soft rhythm through the grass. The road curved the same way. The sky held that pale, steady light that never seemed to belong to any particular day. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. He walked into the workshop. The radio sat at the centre of the table, still, unremarkable, as if it had never done anything at all. The photograph remained beside it. Margaret, caught in that almost moment, still turned slightly away from the camera. But now it no longer felt unfinished. Harold approached slowly, not carefully, not cautiously, just naturally. He reached out and rested his hand on the radio. The wood was cool beneath his fingers, real, present. He did not turn it on. He didn't need to, because whatever had been there had already been said. He picked up the photograph, held it for a moment, not searching for something inside it, not trying to return to anything, just acknowledging. I stayed, he said quietly, not to the room, not to the radio, to something that no longer needed to answer. Then he set it back down, not in the same place as before, closer to the centre, not hidden, not behind anything, where it could be seen. Later that day, there was a knock at the door. Harold opened it without hesitation. Ethan stood there, Lena beside him. The morning light framed them differently now, clearer, less uncertain. "Hey," Ethan said. Harold nodded. "Come in." They entered, no pause this time, no hesitation. The house didn't feel unfamiliar to them any more, not in the same way. They moved into the workshop together. Ethan looked at the radio immediately. "Did it?" Harold shook his head. "No." Ethan stepped closer. "Nothing?" "Nothing." He waited then. "Is that good?" Harold considered that, then nodded. "Yes." Lena watched him carefully. "You don't seem disappointed." "I'm not." Ethan let out a small breath. "I thought maybe it would keep going." Harold glanced at the radio, then at him. It already did. The answer didn't fully settle, not for Ethan, but he didn't push it, not this time. Lena stepped closer to the table. She looked at the photograph, then at Harold. "It's different now," she said. He nodded. "Yes." "How?" A pause. Then, "It's not waiting anymore." The words rested easily in the room. No tension, no resistance, just truth. Ethan leaned back slightly against the wall. "So that's it?" he asked. Harold looked at him. "That's it." Ethan nodded slowly. He didn't look satisfied, but he didn't look confused either, just thoughtful. Lena turned toward the window. The light had shifted again. Softer now, afternoon beginning to lean. She took a breath, then, "What are you going to do?" she asked. The question hung gently, not urgent, not demanding, just present. Harold didn't answer immediately. He looked around the workshop, at the tools, at the table, at the years, then past them. "I think I'll fix things," he said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You already do that?" Harold shook his head slightly. "No." A small pause. "Not like I should have." The words settled, quiet but clear. Ethan looked at him, then away, as if something in that answer had landed closer than he expected. Lena smiled faintly. "That sounds like a start." Harold nodded. "Yes." They didn't stay long. There wasn't a reason to. Not any more. At the door, Ethan paused. He looked back, at the house, at Harold. "You ever think it'll come back on?" he asked. Harold followed his gaze. The radio was no longer visible from where they stood, but its presence remained. "No," he said. Ethan frowned slightly. "You sure?" Harold nodded. "Yes." A small pause. Then, "It doesn't need to." Ethan held that for a moment, then nodded once. "Okay." Lena stepped forward. She looked at Harold, not with curiosity, not with concern, with something quieter, recognition. "You answered," she said. Harold met her gaze. "Yes." She nodded, then turned. They stepped out into the light. The door closed behind them. Harold stood in the quiet of the house, not alone, not in the way he had been before. He walked back into the workshop. The radio remained still. The photograph rested beside it. The light moved across both. Time continued, as it always would. He sat down, not to wait, not to listen, just to be there. And in the silence there was no longer static, no longer distance, no longer something unresolved pressing at the edges. Only what remained, memory, not as something calling him back, but as something that had been carried forward, and finally understood. Outside the wind moved through the grass again. The same rhythm, the same sound, but different, because now it didn't feel like something passing. It felt like something continuing. And Harold Whittaker sat in the quiet of the room, hands resting easily in his lap, the light settling gently around him, not waiting for what had been, but present for what still was,